They thought it would be like every other interview. A few rehearsed jabs, a controlled narrative, and another headline ready to spin the story they wanted. But they forgot one thing. Elon Musk doesn't play by their rules. The cameras were rolling, the questions were sharp, the smiles were polite but loaded. The journalist leaned forward with the confidence of someone who believed they held the upper hand. After all, the media had painted Elon into corners before. They'd called him erratic, arrogant, even dangerous, but what they didn't count on was how ready he was this time. Not to defend himself, but to destroy the illusion. With just one sentence, he changed everything. Do you think the public trusts you more than me? Silence. The kind that chokes, the air. This wasn't just another billionaire being grilled by the press. This was a man who had watched the media twist truths, bury facts, and weaponize narratives. A man who had finally decided, no more playing nice. What followed wasn't a meltdown. It was a reckoning. A cold, calculated dismantling of a system that believed it was untouchable. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He exposed, layer by layer, fact by fact, until the polished veneer of journalism began to crack on live television, and as the reporter sat there, flustered, fumbling for words, it became clear. This wasn't the story they had planned to tell. It was the story they had tried to suppress. It started slowly. At first, it was subtle. Side comments in headlines, selective quotes twisted just enough to shift meaning, and clickbait thumbnails framing Elon like a villain out of a sci-fi dystopia. One article would call him reckless. Another would question his mental stability. It was never outright defamation. It was something far more insidious. A drip feed of doubt engineered to erode public trust one narrative at a time. The media had found its perfect target. A tech mogul with an eccentric streak, a fortune built on disruption, and a Twitter feed that never stayed quiet for long. He was brilliant, yes. But more importantly, he was controversial. And controversy, that sold. At first, Elon didn't push back. He had rockets to launch, cars to perfect, satellites to orbit. Let them talk, he thought. But the more he stayed, silent, the more they filled in the blanks. Suddenly every stumble was a scandal, every joke was a crisis, every move was portrayed not as vision, but as vanity. The power dynamic was clear. They had the platforms, they had the reach, a coordinated headline here, a manipulated soundbite there, and within hours, an entire narrative was cemented. And the public. They were just along for the ride, fed a storyline where questioning the press was taboo, and disagreeing with their depiction meant you were unstable, egotistical, or worse. But this wasn't just about Elon. It was about the game behind the scenes, the way powerful media conglomerates manipulate perception under the guise of journalism. They claim to inform, but often they choose to inflame. Truth becomes secondary to outrage. Balance becomes boring, and when someone refuses to be controlled, that's when the knives come out. They framed him as a danger to democracy, an irresponsible billionaire playing God. They picked apart every word he tweeted, every facial expression in an interview, every staff change at his companies. But they never mentioned the innovation, the jobs created, the industries revolutionized. That part didn't fit the villain arc. It wasn't just unfair, it was calculated. Behind the smiling anchors and polished headlines were boardrooms ruled by advertising revenue and political agendas. And Elon, he was the perfect enemy. Too independent to be bought, too outspoken to be tamed, and too influential to ignore. The betrayal stung because it wasn't just media scrutiny. It was a coordinated character assassination, dressed in credibility. And when he tried to defend himself, they twisted it again, accused him of deflecting, of playing victim, of being paranoid. But it's not paranoia when it's true. People began to notice, not everyone, but enough. Enough to see the pattern, the timing, the the motives. And yet, the machine kept going. Because admitting the media was complicit meant questioning a pillar of public trust. It meant confronting the reality that maybe not all facts are neutral. That maybe power isn't just about money or politics. It's about who controls the story and the media. They weren't just telling stories. They were writing the script of perception, and Elon was done letting them hold the pen. The stakes were bigger than reputation. This was about something deeper, something almost every person watching could feel in their bones. That silent fear of being misunderstood, the helplessness of being misrepresented, the injustice of being labeled by those who never cared to know you. Elon just had the platform to fight back. The rest of us, we're still waiting for our turn. For a long time, Elon stayed quiet. Not because he was weak, not because he didn't see what was happening, but because part of him believed it was the price of doing something great. Disruption always invites resistance, and he had plenty of work to do on Earth, in orbit, and beyond. Let them write what they wanted, he thought. The results would speak louder. But even the strongest minds can be worn down. Even the most resolute can question themselves when the attacks become relentless. And slowly, it began to get under his skin. He started second-guessing tweets before sending them. Public appearances became more calculated. Even interviews, once opportunities to share ideas, turned into verbal minefields. Every word dissected, every sentence weaponized. The lowest point didn't come in the form of a scandal. It came in the form of silence. He began retreating from the platforms he once dominated. He watched as narratives spun wildly out of control. He saw employees affected by public backlash, shareholders rattled by headlines rather than performance, and partners distancing themselves, not because of facts, but because of fear. That was the moment he realized it wasn't just about him anymore. This wasn't personal. It was systemic. And for a man who had dedicated his life to breaking systems that no longer served the world, whether it was the auto industry, the space race, or energy monopolies, this one felt worse, because it wasn't built on science or engineering. It was built on perception, on manipulating minds, on fear-mongering and outrage. That realization hit hard. He wasn't dealing with journalists. He was dealing with gatekeepers, people who had decided which truths were worthy of exposure and which were to be buried. People who wielded influence not to enlighten, but to control. Not to reveal, but to shape. It broke something inside him. There was a night, late, long after the headlines had cooled, but the sting remained. He sat in his office, alone. No engineers, no advisors, no live streams. Just quiet. He scrolled through years of stories, watching the evolution of the smear, the shift from admiration to suspicion, from celebration to demonization, and in that moment, he felt it. Not anger, not sadness, clarity. He realized that no matter how many rockets he launched, no matter how many Teslas he sold or solar panels he installed, it would never be enough to satisfy a media system that thrived on chaos. He could build the future and still be condemned for not following their script. That's when the choice became clear. He could keep playing defense, keep issuing statements, keep letting them write the story, or he could take the pen back. It wasn't a rage-fueled outburst. It was something far more dangerous, calm, intentional, calculated. He decided in that moment that if they wanted a villain, they were going to get one, but not the kind they expected. He wouldn't attack with insults. He'd attack with truth. He began preparing, not for a fight, but for a reckoning. He started collecting data, clipping headlines, logging contradictions, building a case, not in court, but in public view. He'd use the very platforms they tried to shame him off of. He'd bring the receipts, the timestamps, the hypocrisy. The moment he hit send on that first thread, something shifted. It wasn't a rant. It was a mirror. He didn't need to fabricate anything. All he had to do was reflect what was already there. And as the likes poured in, the retweets spread like wildfire, and the silence from the usual media defenders grew deafening. It became clear. The power was shifting. It started with a single clip, just over 30 seconds long. Elon sat across from a well-known anchor on a national broadcast, one known for cornering guests with thinly veiled judgment and smugly packaged questions. The interview had been prepped like any other. He was there to talk about technology, sustainability, maybe Mars. But the host had different plans. Halfway through the interview, the tone shifted. The questions became less about facts, more about feelings. Do you think your tweets are damaging to society? Some say you're promoting misinformation. How do you respond to that? Then came the insinuation that Elon's platforms were becoming echo chambers of hate, conspiracy, and chaos. It was a trap, wrapped in concern. But this time, Elon didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned in, calm, surgical. Do you believe everything the media puts out is fair, balanced, and free of bias? The anchor paused, smiling, trying to regain control. Elon continued, unwavering. You're not here to ask questions. You're here to frame answers. The FE studio fell quiet. The moment went viral before the segment even aired in full. Someone had clipped it, uploaded it. Within hours, it had millions of views. People weren't just watching. They were nodding, commenting, sharing their own stories of being misrepresented, manipulated, or muted by media that seemed less interested in truth and more invested in narrative control. Then came the second clip. This one wasn't from the interview. It was from inside the newsroom. A whistleblower had leaked internal memos, emails, Slack messages, editorial notes, real documentation showing how coverage of Elon had been slanted, shaped, and sometimes outright ordered from above. Journalists told not to cover certain Tesla milestones. Editors pushing for harsher angles on SpaceX failures. Language like contain the narrative and maximize public distrust. It was the smoking gun. Suddenly, it wasn't Elon versus a biased interviewer. It was Elon versus a system, one exposed by its own inner workings. The public was stunned, not because they suspected it, but because now they had proof. And Elon. He didn't gloat. He amplified. He began posting the documents, redacted where necessary, but always with context. Here's how they told the story, he'd write. Here's what they left out. He shared timelines of headlines against events, showing the correlation between negative coverage and key stock movements, government contracts, or competing interests. The picture he painted wasn't speculative, it was surgical. He didn't just poke holes in the narrative, he dismantled it, and people started waking up. Journalists who had once criticized him began admitting, carefully at first, that maybe there was pressure from above. Industry insiders, editors, interns, even producers started leaking more. Not just from one outlet, but from many. The same patterns, the same tactics, the same fear of losing access, funding, or credibility if they didn't toe the line. It wasn't just about Elon anymore. It was about every voice that had been drowned out by editorial agendas, every truth reshaped into profitable controversy, every honest story buried beneath layers of curated outrage. The media machine that once dictated what the world believed was now under scrutiny like never before. And here was Elon. Once there, favorite target, standing at the center of it, not as a martyr, but as a disruptor. Not because he had power, but because he had receipts and a platform they couldn't silence. Then came the final blow. A coalition of independent journalists, some of whom had been blacklisted or labeled problematic by mainstream outlets, released a report. It wasn't about Elon specifically, but about the broader structure of media manipulation. It included interviews, financial trails, exposed conflicts of interest, and case studies showing how certain narratives were artificially amplified or suppressed. It validated everything he'd been saying. And the timing. Perfect. Because it aired just days after another failed hit piece. A mainstream article attempting to link Elon to a foreign propaganda scheme. But this time, no one bought it. The public had already seen behind the curtain. The outrage didn't come from Elon's camp. It came from regular people, engineers, teachers, veterans, nurses, young entrepreneurs, immigrants, people who'd been told for years what to think, who to trust, and who to fear. People who now realized that their doubts had been justified all along. The role reversal was complete. The institutions that once spoke with authority were now being questioned. And the man they tried to brand as reckless, he had become the one voice many now believed was telling the uncomfortable truth. Not because he was perfect, but because he refused to be scripted. And when the interviewer who had once tried to trap him went back on air to clarify her position, this time with noticeably less arrogance, viewers noticed something different. Her tone had changed. Her authority was gone. Her questions were no longer weapons. They were apologies in disguise. She wasn't leading the conversation anymore. She was chasing it. Justice didn't come with a bang. It came with a whisper. Quiet at first, then a ripple, then a wave so powerful that not even the most fortified newsroom walls could hold it back. In the weeks following the exposés, viewership numbers began to slide. Advertisers, once proud, sponsors of prestige journalism, started pulling back, unwilling to be associated with what was now being referred to across social platforms as the credibility crisis. Anchors who had once smirked through rehearsed outrage now looked visibly nervous on screen. Editorial boards released statements. "We take journalistic integrity seriously," but the damage had been done. One by one, stories were retracted, tweets deleted. Op-eds disappeared into archives with no trace. The same platforms that had amplified hit pieces against Elon were now trying to scrub the record clean. But the internet doesn't forget, and neither did the people. Some journalists tried to pivot. They went from criticizing him to covering him objectively. Suddenly, they wanted to talk about the progress of Starship, the breakthroughs in AI, the humanitarian efforts through Neuralink. But the shift wasn't subtle. It was desperate. It wasn't reporting. It was damage control. Because now, the audience had options. Independent creators, podcasters, long-form analysts, and ex-reporters who had once been pushed to the fringes were being heard more than ever. They had no teleprompters, no corporate sponsors, just raw analysis, proof, and conviction. And in that new space, Elon didn't have to defend himself. The truth did it for him. The networks that once controlled the public narrative found themselves on the defensive. Lawsuits emerged, not from Elon, but from people wrongfully dragged into media firestorms in pursuit of clicks. Internal whistleblowers became public figures, some even testifying before regulatory bodies. And suddenly, for the first time in decades, there was serious talk about holding media conglomerates accountable. Accountability wasn't just a buzzword anymore. It was a movement. And Elon, he kept building. He didn't dance on anyone's grave. He didn't celebrate the downfall of those who tried to crush him. He simply moved forward, with a calm defiance that spoke louder than any speech. But the public noticed something different about him. Not bitterness, not vengeance, but peace. Because when you've told the truth in the face of relentless distortion, and the world finally sees it for what it is, there's a quiet kind of justice in that. One that doesn't need headlines or applause. He started speaking more, freely again, joking online, visiting universities, engaging with people directly, without intermediaries twisting his words. And where there was once caution, now there was clarity. Where there was hesitation, now there was command. The final moment came not on a news broadcast, but during a live Q&A session at a tech summit. An audience member asked, "What do you think is the biggest threat to progress?" Elon didn't hesitate. Mistrust of truth. When people are trained to question facts but not agendas. When outrage becomes currency and honesty becomes dangerous, that's when progress dies. The room fell silent, not out of fear, but out of realization. Because everyone there knew he wasn't just talking about media, He was talking about something much deeper, about every system that relies on illusion, every gatekeeper who assumes the crowd will never peek behind the curtain. And yet, he had peeked. He had torn the curtain down. The poetic justice wasn't in their downfall. It was in the rebuilding. New platforms emerged, transparent, decentralized, untouchable by traditional manipulation. Voices once marginalized now commanded millions. The monopoly on truth was broken, not because Elon fought for himself, but because he fought for the right to speak freely, to question narratives, to not be owned. In the end, the same institutions that tried to bury him had unknowingly built his stage. And as for the reporter, the one who once looked him in the eye, certain of her control, she quietly left the network months later. No grand announcement, no farewell broadcast, just another name in a long list of those who underestimated the power of truth in a world starving for it. He didn't need revenge, because justice had already been served. They lost the one thing they couldn't afford to lose: trust. While he walked away with something far greater: dignity, vindication, and the unshakable loyalty of a public that this time had seen everything for themselves. Because once the veil is lifted, it can never be pulled back again. And in that truth, real, undeniable truth, he found his greatest victory.